Okay, well, thank you very much. And thanks to Josh and other organisers of the Melbourne Forum, current name, for inviting me. I very much appreciate the opportunity of coming to Melbourne and talking to you. I think organisations like this are really, really important. The politicians aren't going to move very quickly. In terms of issues which are not simple, they need some serious encouragement. And I think back to the same-sex marriage debate. Now, clearly there were politicians who were supportive, but it was at the grassroots where the action was really happening. And, of course, the debate was won. And hopefully the debate will be won down the track in terms of understanding macroeconomics. So a well-educated polity is all important, and it starts with groups like this. Okay, so some of you may remember the 2014 budget. This is not the first word on budget repair, lifters not leaners, we're a great nation, blah, blah, blah. You may also remember what happened to that 2014 budget. The crossbenchers frustrated pretty well all of Joe Hockey's initiatives. And if we go back a bit further, of course, Peter Costello talked about deficit and debt and the fact that the Labour Party, when in government, had left a residual of high debt and high deficits. And he's talking about progressing to surpluses. And I'll say more about Costello later on. Now, these are powerful messages. And of course, metaphors tend to reinforce what may be, to some, less familiar messages with some sort of economics in them. So the country maxing out its credit card, or we can't leave debt to future generations, or if Australia carries on like this running deficits, and obviously they're not currently running deficits, they're heading towards surplus, which I'll come on to, but back in those days they were running deficits, then of course Australia will become insolvent just like Greece. So the message that those politicians gave, and still the predominant message out there, is the federal government is subject to the same financial constraints as a household. So if it spends more than it receives in taxes, then Orthodox economics says if it borrows, then it's likely interest rates will rise. And indeed, as I say, insolvency is a risk. There will be rising debt. And higher interest rates will threaten investment. I think we all agree that investment is very important. Investment, obviously, in the right sectors of the economy. The alternative that a government has, and I'll come back to this later on, is to, quote unquote, print money. And then, of course, the world will fall in because there will be higher inflation, and if government persists engaging in deficits, then we'll have hyperinflation and we'll become just like Zimbabwe. Now, the curious thing about all that is that, except for counterfeiters, and I assume there are still a few around, although the currency has become fairly difficult to counterfeit, the Australian government is the monopoly issuer of the currency. So an interesting question to pose is, why would you choose to borrow in the currency that you issue? And indeed, in talking about how expenditure or net spending is financed, net over and above taxes, there is a serious question about what actually is going on here. It seems unnecessary to engage in borrowing if you are issuing the currency. And I'll attempt to answer that question later on. Now, these debates about the role and capabilities of the federal government must be put in context. What should be the objectives of policymakers in the macroeconomy? Now, orthodox or mainstream economics tends to talk in terms of creating an appropriate environment for the private sector. So, limited regulation, we need low inflation, and we really need low government spending and taxing. And a good example of this recently, of course, was the tax bill that the Morrison government got through, which involved, if the title was rather awkward and rather long, but it was basically about people having more money for them to spend. It was all about, well, if government spends money, it's a bad thing, so we'll leave households with more money and they'll spend as they wish. Now, I'm not opposed to tax cuts where they are appropriately directed. And down the track, of course, we can have a very unprogressive tax system. So the orthodox view is essentially if markets actually work, so prices and wages move up and down, then we should have full employment. And these ideas, which I'm not going to go to in any more detail than I have already, really do originate with Friedman and Phelps back in the 60s. And this was a response, or in fact, it wasn't a response, it was, in a sense, fortuitous for Friedman and Phelps that they started putting forward these arguments for an exclusive focus on monetary policy in advance of the oil price shocks, which essentially destroyed the idea of a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And I think Bill touched on this when he was talking about the job guarantee and obviously the question of inflation. So we have a market system which allegedly works, and we have macro policy very much geared to monetary policy, as of course is still the case, to control inflation. And the reason for doing that was to provide a certain economic environment for people to make decisions, whether it be individuals, households, or firms. And sometimes we talk about low stable inflation as being price stability, which is a bit confusing, but that's what price stability means. Now, on the other hand, one of the main claims of heterodox economics, within which MMT sits, is that total output and employment in the economy are driven by effective demand, that's total spending. So if you're looking for an explanation of persistent unemployment, and indeed underutilization more generally, which incorporates underemployment, which even politicians talk about nowadays, it's not because of a malfunctioning market system, it is the absence of sufficient total spending. So heterodox economists in general, and MMT in particular, would say the problem of persistent unemployment is in fact insufficient spending, and that can be remedied by government either directly engaging in projects, whether it's infrastructure or whatever, or by attempting to persuade the private sector to spend more, which can be via income tax cuts and or subsidies to promote investment and that sort of thing. And that sort of policy prescription does raise the question of deficits and whether deficits are sustainable. So by fiscal deficit, of course, we're talking about a situation where government expenditure is in excess of taxes. So I hope to provide some insights about these issues by reference, of course, to modern monetary theory. Now, a very brief statement about modern monetary theory, which may seem highly cryptic and almost indecipherable, and I'll be talking about these aspects of modern monetary theory as we progress. The abbreviated way of talking about modern monetary theory is it embraces the principles of chartalism and functional finance, but it is grounded in institutional practice. Now, that's the institutional practice part is something I think is exceedingly important. And, well, let me carry on and I'll explain why. Modern monetary theory takes account of how key macro institutions operate. And here we mean the central bank, treasury, and the commercial banks. And it's not some arcane theory devised in an ivory tower. It's actually understanding what they do. And central banks are very good in this respect because they do tell you what they do, how they behave, say the Reserve Bank of Australia, the RBA, how it behaves on a day-to-day basis. And any theory of macroeconomics which has got credibility has got to take account of how these institutions work. Now, chartalism is based on the view of money, state money, reflecting the fact that the state typically wants to affect economic activity. So we talk about a fiat currency issued by the state, a unit of account, here we mean Australian dollars, which has value because the state can levy taxes. And this is a fundamental point, and we talk about taxes driving money. So the value of the currency arises because the state insists that taxes are not paid by a farmer bringing a cow in to fulfill their tax obligations. It's the farmer or anybody else has got to provide the currency, whether in electronic form or in hard cash. So fiat currency is currency that a government has stated is legal tender. So any transaction in this country should take place via the use of Australian dollars. But it has no or very little intrinsic value. And it's not backed by a precious commodity. Functional finance is based on the view that fiscal policy, in other words, treasury spending and taxing, needs to be adopted to counteract economic fluctuations and secure full employment and low inflation, but we shouldn't need to take account of fiscal deficits or accumulated debt. And that has its origins in the work of Abba Lerner 70-odd years ago, 75 years ago, 76. So this is upfront that really fiscal policy should be geared to those domestic policy objectives. Now, of course, MMT hasn't been without its critics of late, who make similar claims to those of the Australian treasurers. In case anybody in the audience hasn't seen this, this was a resolution in May of this year, US Senate resolution. You can read it, deficits being unsustainable, irresponsible, and so on. A condemnation of MMT. And what is interesting is those who are quoted in the resolution, including Lawrence Summers, Jerome Powell, who's getting rather a hard time from President Trump. If you did believe in central bank independence, you might start wondering with Trump's treatment of Powell as to whether it still exists, if it ever did. And Janet Yellen, previous RBA governor, and representatives of various right-wing organisations. So we're attracting some controversy. Now, the structure of the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about financial balances and move on to the so-called government budget constraint or fiscal constraint. I am going to talk about central banks briefly for reasons which will become clear, and then debt and interest rates, currency, sovereignty, sectoral balances, fiscal stimulus, and the question of fiscal policy and hyperinflation. So I've got a fairly ambitious few minutes ahead. Anyway, we'll see how we go. Should I say, if anybody wants any points, or wants to make any points of clarification or seek clarification, do not hesitate to ask. But I don't want to engage at this point in debate, otherwise we'll never finish. Okay, now one particular aspect of MMT is that it adopts very rigorous stock flow consistent modelling. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, we can think of flows like the flow of water into a bath, and we can think of a stock as the quantity of water in a bath. So the flow has to be expressed per period of time. The stock is simply dated. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there was 80 litres of water in the bath, and water was flowing in at 5 metres a minute or whatever, 5 litres a minute. So in terms of individual sectors of the economy or individuals, we can think of their flow of income over a period of time, and we can think of their flow of expenditure over a period of time. And we can say the difference between the two is going to be represented in terms of, at least in the short run, their stock of financial assets, which can be a range of things like bank deposit shares, corporate bonds, blah, blah, blah. If we confined it just to deposits in a bank, if you earn 1,000 a month or 1,000 a week, let's say, and you spend 900, then your stock of deposits has gone up 100. I hope I got that the right way around. Income 1,000, spending 900. Yeah. So you've actually saved 100, and that is picked up in the net change in financial assets. Now, you may then spend that $100 on a cheap picture or some sort of real item, but we won't go there. Now, that statement is purely an accounting statement. What you earned, what you spent, and the impact on your financial balance. And what we know from what essentially is a very simple point is, for an individual household, consistent overspending, in other words, spending greater than your corresponding income, is impossible unless you have a very large stock of wealth already, whether it be in the form of financial assets or real assets that you can actually sell so that you can finance this rather extravagant spending, which is greater than your income. Now, that turns out, of course, to be a very important point. If the household sector or the private sector more generally is always subject to negative financial balances, then this is not sustainable. Did I go one step too far? Just go. Yeah, no, that's all right. Okay, now I want to talk about the government fiscal constraint, which is based on the same sort of principles, in that on the left-hand side we have flows of expenditure, net expenditure in total, and on the right-hand side we have changes in stocks. So we've got government spending minus taxation for a period of time. Again, it's a flow per period of time. But we also have the fact that government has sold debt in the past. So there's a stock of debt B, which is being held by the non-government sector. Think of it purely, if you like, in terms of the private sector. And interest is being paid each period. So the government financial balance is given by that left-hand side. If that is positive, then the government is running a deficit and its financial balance is deteriorating. Now, on the other side is interpreted as being how the government is going to finance that negative balance. In other words, the government spending more than it is receiving in taxation. So orthodoxy identifies there are two ways of addressing the problem. One is to essentially sell debt to make up the shortfall. And that can be combined with printing money, so-called, which is actually changing the monetary base. Now, I'm not going to go into the monetary base very much, but you no doubt all familiar with this pejorative term, namely printing money. So yes, government can fund its net spending by either borrowing, delta B, or printing money, and printing money is terrible. That's the essential message. So again, as I say, we've got flows on the left-hand side and we've got changes in stocks on the other side. Now, orthodoxy views this as a planning type of equation, relationship. It's in fact an identity, so it holds by definition. So government can say to itself, well, we anticipate a deficit of 10 billion, so the right-hand side is positive, and what are we going to do about financing it? Should we issue $10 billion worth of debt, print some money, or entirely finance it by printing money? So, compared to you and I, governments, according to this interpretation, have another option that we don't. Unfortunately, we can't individually print money for the very simple reason that nobody will accept it. Now, you can print an IOU, that's different. And then whether somebody accepts it depends on whether you're plausible or not in terms of whether you're going to repay. Now, mainstream interprets this as a budget identity. As I say, it's a planning mechanism for government. And they come up with some rather unfortunate consequences of running a deficit. So if the deficit is funded, let's say, entirely by additional bond issue, in other words, selling debt, then interest rates are alleged to increase and crowd out spending. In other words, investment is alleged to be sensitive to interest rates. Of course, that's what firms are having to pay in interest when they borrow to finance their investment. Why is it argued interest rates will rise? Well, there is this idea of a stock of finance out there, and now we've both got the private sector seeking finance, but we've also got this extra component of demand for finance coming from the public sector. And those two together signifies an increase in demand for finance, and that must lead to the price, in other words, the interest rate going up. And secondly, and I've sort of pointed to this already, if we go the other route, which is to print money, a terribly misleading term, increase the monetary base is a better way of putting it, it's claimed to increase the money supply, and that's claimed to be inflationary. So you can see from this discussion here that orthodox economists, mainstream economists who believe the economy tends to work pretty well if you create the right conditions, are very hostile to budget deficits. Now, that hostility to deficits originated around the time of Friedman and his theory of inflation, Friedman and Phelps. That hostility to deficits has persisted ever since and still persists because the focus of macro policy remains monetary policy. Now, rather than saying, well, how does MMT rebut this, I'm going to go on a slight tangent, which is relevant to the arguments. And this may be familiar to some of you who came to Stephen's talk earlier in the year. So I want to talk briefly about the institutional practices of central banks, in other words, what they actually do. Now, most central banks have a remit in the legislation, which, broadly speaking, talks about full employment in a fairly wishy-washy way and low, stable inflation. And the way that central banks do that nowadays in most advanced economies is to set a short-term target interest rate, and in Australia that's referred to as the cash rate. And of course, it is set once a month, the first Tuesday of the month, and obviously it coincides with Melbourne Cup Day when we reach November. Now, in stating that cash rate, which is currently 1%, the Reserve Bank are committing to achieve this target rate. And they are committing to achieve this rate, which is the rate at which banks lend to each other. And I'll come on to that a bit more in a moment. Now, the effect of changing the cash rate is to change the structure of interest rates, both short-term and long-term. And for purposes of borrowing, of course, whether it's borrowing for houses or firms borrowing for investment purposes, it's longer-term rates which are important. Now, the Reserve Bank is not solely confined with meeting once a month after a good lunch and deciding what the cash rate's going to be. They have the responsibility of making sure the interbank rate, the actual rate, corresponds to the cash rate, but equally that the financial system actually works reasonably well. And if the banking system is not working well, which typically is associated with not having enough liquidity to meet the needs of their customers, then that can create significant financial uncertainty. Now, what the banks do is they obviously receive deposits, they make decisions about loans, and they must hold reserves to meet the liquidity needs of the customers. And let me just give you an example to sort of flesh out what I'm going to be saying here. If you think about going to JB Hi-Fi and buying a phone for $1,000, then you finalise the transaction by handing over your debit card, and you know that two things are going to happen. One thing is your account's going to be debited $1,000, and you know that at some time relatively quickly, JB Hi-Fi's account is going to be credited by $1,000. Now, let's say you bank at ANZ and JB Hi-Fi banks at Westpac. If nothing else happens, then Westpac are worse off. JB Hi-Fi's deposits have gone up $1,000. So JB Hi-Fi could waltz into the Westpac bank, withdraw all their deposits, and it'll be $1,000 more than it was before the transaction. ANZ Bank, your bank, is $1,000 for the moment better off because your deposits, which are liabilities to them, because you can march in and take the rest out, your deposits have fallen $1,000. So you may think the transaction is complete where there's been that transfer from you to JB Hi-Fi, but that's only half the story. Because what has to happen is that your bank has to transfer, and obviously they don't do it manually, $1,000 to the bank of JB Hi-Fi. And then the transaction is complete. And the significance of this will become clear in just a moment. So banks hold reserves to meet these requirements, and these are assets for the bank. Bank reserves take the form of their deposits at the central bank, who are the banker for your standard high street bank. And also, of course, they hold cash. And that is part of their reserves. In other words, vault cash. Obviously, every bank branch has vault cash, some of it stuffed into an ATM machine. Now, if the banks are short of reserves, then they can borrow from other banks. This is the interbank market. And I mentioned setting the target interbank rate. And the RBA, for the moment, has determined that the interbank rate should be 1%. So if the banks are running short of reserves, or a bank is, and let's say it's your bank, because $1,000 is going to be transferred to the other bank, then they can either borrow on the interbank market if there are other banks prepared to lend them money, or they can borrow from the central bank. Now, clearly they don't willingly borrow from the central bank because the central bank charges 25 basis points higher than the interbank rate. So they charge 1.25% currently. Banks will earn interest on their reserves that they're holding of 0.75%, below the cash rate. So clearly what banks should do is to hold low reserves, as low as possible, which are paying 0.75%, and lend any excess reserves to other banks, paying 1%. The only restriction on banks is that they must have positive reserves. So you can see what the rationale for an interbank market, in other words, banks lending to each other. Why do they do it? Because if everybody who banks at ANZ is going out and spending vast amounts on mobile phones or whatever, there will be a loss of reserves for the ANZ Bank, and it's potentially going to have to borrow to have a sufficient level of reserves, or even a positive level of reserves, which is must do. Now, the Reserve Bank fits into this story because if it thinks there are excess reserves in the banking system across all banks, then it must take action. Because if the banks who have got excess reserves offer these reserves on the interbank market, then it's likely that there's going to be, well, there will be a fall in the interbank rate. We're saying there's a system surplus. Banks collectively hold more reserves than they want. And so what will happen is the interbank rate will fall. Now, that is the last thing the Reserve Bank wants. It has stated what the interbank rate, the target rate should be, the cash rate, 1%. If the interbank rate goes down to 0.9, monetary policy is being compromised. and that creates uncertainty. So what can they do to address that? And what they can do is, as we'll see, is to sell debt to the banks to drain that excess liquidity. And that's how we can see that, debt plays a very key role in the behavior of the Reserve Bank. Rather than looking at the financing of fiscal policy, I've moved to looking at the Reserve Bank and saying, well, actually debt is important. And I'll become clearer about this when I go to actual fiscal policy. Now, what I want to do is to illustrate some of these ideas by talking about net government spending, in other words, the operation of stimulatory fiscal policy. I'm going to use balance sheets in a very simple way. So the Reserve Bank, it has assets, and for our purposes, it holds some government debt, what I'm calling treasury bonds. It has treasury deposits because the bank for the treasury is the central bank. It holds bank reserves because the central bank is banker for the commercial banks. Commercial banks hold debt, treasury bonds. They hold bank reserves. So those two representations of bank reserves are equal, but the level of treasury bonds in central banks as opposed to commercial banks can be quite different. And then commercial banks' liabilities here, for our purposes, is simply, let's say, just the private sector deposits. Those are the important liabilities that we're concerned about here. So this is a simplified balance sheet for both the Reserve Bank and the commercial banks. We're not interested in net worth. We're not interested in all the different types of assets. Now, Treasury is going to operate fiscal policy as instructed by the government. It's the agent for government in conducting fiscal policy. Treasury has an account at the RBA, as we said. Treasury has been instructed to spend $100. So net spend, now obviously it doesn't work normally like that, so it's anticipated there's going to be a deficit of $100. But it does, at least as far as the Americans are concerned, and this just happens to be an easier way of doing it for this purpose, it should have sufficient balances in its account before it spends. So what we'll assume is that Treasury needs to, first of all, borrow from the Reserve Bank. Then it has sufficient deposits, as shown at the top there under RBA liabilities. It can then spend. And then we're going to see what the implication is for the balances in the Reserve Bank and in the commercial banks. So, stage one, the transaction between the Reserve Bank, which buys Treasury bonds from Treasury. So what I'm measuring here at each stage is simply the change that's taken place at that stage. So the first stage is that the assets of the Reserve Bank go up $100. And Treasury are paid by their account at the Reserve Bank being increased by $100. So looking at the balance sheet, albeit a rather skinny balance sheet, the financial position of the Reserve Bank hasn't changed. It's acquired more assets, simultaneously acquired more liabilities, and nothing's happened to the commercial banks. Then we're going to, in the second stage, we're going to say, right, Treasury now spends. It it buys goods and services from the private sector. So Treasury deposits are going to fall, and simultaneously, the providers of those goods and services to government, their deposits will go up because government will ultimately pay. Probably not very quickly, but they will pay. So the $100 of expenditure by Treasury shows up as increased deposits for the private sector, non-government sector. For the same reason as I was arguing in terms of buying a phone, bank reserves have to go up 100 as well, because the liabilities have gone up, and obviously the banks would be worse off if there wasn't a crediting of reserves held by the banks. So our bank reserves figure, and remember those two figures are the same, those bank reserves have gone up as an asset for the commercial banks and simultaneously gone up as a liability for the central bank, the Reserve Bank. Now, where are we going to with all this? Well, deposits have gone up, and potentially the non-government sector can go off and spend on whatever, do whatever it likes. Reserves have gone up 100, and the banks collectively may decide that reserves are rather more than they wish to hold, because they want to economize on reserves and, if possible, lend at 1% as opposed to receiving 0.75 from the central bank. So we have excess reserves in the system. And the Reserve Bank knows all very well that if they don't do something about it, there's going to be a compromising of monetary policy. So what do? They attempt to sell Treasury bonds, and that will mop up the excess reserves. So here we're assuming that banks actually only want to hold an extra $10 of reserves. So they're happy to buy $90 worth of Treasury bonds. And once they bought those, they're happy. So what happens, therefore, and here remember we're comparing to the previous situation, we're saying, okay, compared to where we were there, bank reserves fall 90. Simultaneously, commercial banks have now got $90 worth of Treasury bonds. And as far as the central bank is concerned, they've lost $90 worth of Treasury bonds because they've sold them. But equally, their liability has fallen as well, because the way that the transaction took place was central bank simply said, okay, you're buying $90 worth of bonds from us, your reserves are going to fall 90. So we've had a series of transactions, and at each stage we have taken account of the change that's gone on in that stage. And so to find out the final outcome, we simply have to add the corresponding items in the first three rows and then stick them there. So Treasury bonds went up 100 and went down 90. So the bank is holding an extra $10. Its reserves, well, there are a number of things going on here, but ultimately bank reserves went up 100 and down 90, and so bank reserves are plus 10, and I could have added Treasury deposits are unchanged. They went up 100, went down 100. Doing the corresponding exercise over here, we can see that bank reserves obviously went up 10 for the banks, corresponding to the central bank as it should. Treasury bonds went up 90, deposits went up 100. Now again, the financial position of both the central bank and the commercial banks overall is unchanged. Extra assets, extra liabilities, matching, and likewise on this side, extra liabilities of 100 in total, extra assets in different forms of 100 too. So we've looked at the operation of fiscal policy. We've taken account of the fact that the central bank has a role to play, not only in setting the cash rate, but also ensuring that the cash rate actually happens, in the sense that banks exchange reserves with each other at that cash rate. And we've identified by assumption that there were excess reserves. So the Reserve Bank sold debt that soaked up the excess reserves, and we've ended up with that scenario. So if you go back to our identity, that fiscal constraint or budget constraint that orthodoxy talked about, on the left-hand side, we have a deficit of 100. The monetary base has gone up 10, and the overall holding of bonds by the non-government sector have gone up 90. Now, that is identical to the government fiscal constraint. What's the interpretation? It is an ex post accounting identity. In other words, it's actually what happened. There wasn't any discretionary decision-making being made here. The reserve, obviously the amount of net spending was discretionary. Putting that aside, the Reserve Bank did what it had to do. In other words, to maintain the integrity of monetary policy, it had to sell debt to soak up the reserves. So it's simply an accounting statement. Banks only wanted to hold $10 of extra reserves, so they had therefore $90 of excess reserves, and it was necessary to sell them debt. And if they hadn't, monetary policy would have been compromised. Now, that is a very different interpretation of an identity. It's not a financing decision that's made in advance. Shall we fund our prospective expenditure by borrowing, or shall we print money, whatever that means? This is the workings of the system, and the fact that the Reserve Bank has a particular role in the system. So the sale of debt here does not finance the deficit, but it soaks up the excess reserves. So if you go back to my question, why would government sell debt in Australian dollars when it is an issuer of Australian dollars? The answer is that it's the Reserve Bank selling debt, and it's not selling debt directly because of fiscal policy. It's selling debt because of its obligations with respect to monetary policy. Now, in practice, what happens is that when the decisions about budgets and spending are made, the Australian Office of Financial Management sells debt according to what they refer to as the borrowing requirement. In other words, what they think the deficit is going to be. And to the layperson, which doesn't include you, by the way, the impression is given that debt is being sold to finance that spending. Now, what is interesting is the Debt Management Office of the UK acknowledges that this full funding, in other words, debt being issued in line with prospective government deficit, is a policy. It's not some institutional given, you've just got to do this. It is actually a policy, which in principle can be changed. And they're trying to separate debt management, which is this bit, from monetary policy. So what we've shown here is, to use Bill's terminology, we've lifted the ideological veil to show that debt issue and sale to the non-government sector is not a financing operation by the Treasury. It's about liquidity management. They had to, the Reserve Bank that is, had to sell that debt to soak up the extra reserves that were created by expansionary fiscal policy, and there is now an extra $90 worth of debt held by the non-government sector. Now, I am moving reasonably well, I think. Right, so I now want to move on to the issue of debt and interest rates and address front on, so to speak, the issue of solvency. Is it not the case that if we keep running deficits and accumulating more and more debt, that we're going to end up with a crisis? Now, in the immediate aftermath of the GFC, fiscal deficits as a share of GDP, which I don't show, and gross government debt as a share of GDP rose in most Western economies, largely because what's referred to as automatic stabilizers. Now, fiscal policy operates as an automatic stabilizer in the sense that deficits tend to rise in a recession and fall in a boom. And the reason for that is reasonably straightforward. In a recession, household incomes are lower, employment is lower, and therefore tax receipts are lower. And if we treat government spending as more or less constant, then it means that there will be a higher deficit or a smaller surplus in a recession. And conversely, if you think of an upturn. Now, so the reality post-GFC for a range of countries, and I'll show you some pictures in a minute, was that the debt ratio went up, debt to GDP. And the concern is that a rising debt trajectory will lead to higher interest rates. And that, of course, reinforces the problem of debt. Because I'll explain that in a minute, but so I don't have to backtrack. Now, here's the Eurozone countries. The range of them, not all of them, but some of the key ones: France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and the Euro area, which is all of them. And what you see very clearly is the debt ratio, beginning of 2008, increased in all those countries. And Greece is particularly high. And I haven't got my glasses on, which doesn't help. And what's happened since around 2012 is that these debt ratios have flattened off, or in some cases, steeply declined. The blue one, by the way, the light blue one, is Germany. Now, the question is, what happened to long-term interest rates on this debt? And what you find is, well, some very interesting things. Firstly, international investors before the global financial crisis, and sorry, that seems to have moved, 2008 is to the left of the vertical line, there was no real distinction made between those countries. So the interest rate that was being paid was pretty much the same. I mean, the differential was very small. Once the GFC hit, then there was a sudden spike, and that's Greece. And you can see what the rate got to, 22.5%. And then you've got Portugal as well, it went up, Ireland went up, and basically the so-called PIGS economies which is slightly offensive, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, they all experienced significantly higher rates, which, as I argue, reinforces the debt trajectory. Now, after around 2012, rates start falling. So that's an interesting question. Why did that happen? Okay, so I've dealt with the first 2 points. The third point is it's worth pointing out that, well, sorry, I should say the first point is very important. Eurozones must finance deficits by issuing debt. So the changing the monetary base option doesn't exist. So any country that had experienced a housing boom and then a bust was in big trouble. And Ireland is a good example. Of course, the banks went virtually bust, and the Irish government bailed the banks out with a very substantial injection, which shows up with a spike in what happened to the debt ratio. Later, there were central bank bailouts. Sorry, that's the point I've just made. And that just to emphasize that if a country is experiencing a high interest rate on debt, then that magnifies the deficit. So IB gets higher and leads to a higher deficit. The other point I'll make is that the European Central Bank, and this might come on the next slide. Yes, so firstly, Ireland in particular made an arrangement with the Troika, which is the European Commission, I think it's European Commission plus the IMF plus the ECB, fairly nasty set of institutions. They had to borrow in order to survive. Later, the ECB made a commitment to buy members' debt and do what it takes, and that explained why rates went down. Interestingly, of course, these countries are subject to the Stability and Growth Pact, and without going back and looking at both deficits and debt, one can say compliance has been very sporadic. The key point here is that Eurozone members are not what we refer to as currency sovereign. They have given up their own currencies to join the Eurozone. So the euro, from the point of view of any of those Eurozone countries, is effectively a foreign currency because they don't have the capacity, their central banks do not have the capacity to create euros. And that is fundamentally important and explains why the Eurozone's dysfunctional. Okay, let me contrast that with what I'll be defining as currency sovereign economies: Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, United Kingdom, United States. Now, this is Australia, the green line. So again, we're talking gross government debt. And you can see that it was quite high in 1999 and came down. And this corresponded to Costello running surpluses and selling off debt. And of course, he prided himself on being, he was never announced as the world's best treasurer. He probably thinks he is anyway, but he ran a series of surpluses. On the other hand, to go to the other extreme, here we have Japan, which already had a pretty high debt ratio, and it got progressively higher. Now, there are all sorts of issues with Japan, an aging population, and so on and so on. But the point, all I'm concerned about here is that, again, all countries experienced a rise in the debt ratio after around 2008, and they've all somewhat flattened off since. And in part, it's a sort of restatement of the importance of running surpluses, not deficits. And you've got two extreme cases in terms of Australia and Japan. Now, this is the long-term interest rates. And what you see post-GFC is, albeit with a few upward movements, and New Zealand is one of them, and equally Australia as well. Of course, they clearly didn't work out that the financial crisis is quite severe. What you see is that rates fell. And until the US and the UK started raising them again, but this is 8 years after the GFC. So the question is, what explains that? And there are two pretty straightforward reasons. Firstly, as we all know, countries, including Australia, cut their official rates. Cash rates come down. It then stayed pretty static at, 1.5%, and now it's come down to 1%. The Japanese rate, short-term rate, is around 0. And Japanese, I should probably go back to Japan, because this is the country with of these countries with the highest debt ratio, and you can see where its interest rate is. So it's incredibly low. It's now gone into negative territory because of setting negative interest rates. So the idea that a country which is currency sovereign, and I'll define it more clearly in a minute, can become insolvent by running deficits, accumulating debt, and paying interest on that debt is clearly fundamentally untrue, unless there's something particularly peculiar about Japan. And any notion that Australia is becoming like Greece because its debt ratio has increased since Costello era, that's equally untrue because the rate in Australia has come down as well. Now, sorry, it says 2020. You might think I've got some, I've been crystal ball gazing. These are projections by the OECD. Okay, so why did the rates fall in the countries? Well, I mentioned the monetary policy initiatives. The other thing is, if you like, a shift to quality. International investors bought debt which they recognized had a 0 probability of default. Debt was denominated in the country's own currency. You can never default if you issue debt in your own currency. Putting it crudely, you've got the key to the room where the printing press is. Now, obviously, you don't normally settle debts with cash, not large debts anyway. So there is a fundamental distinction between that group of countries and the Eurozone countries. So we refer to those last set of countries as currency sovereign. Firstly, they have their own currencies. And I've talked about taxes driving money. So those currencies have value because of taxes being imposed in those currencies. The ideal for any country in the modern monetary system is to be able to devote monetary and fiscal policy to domestic objectives. In other words, full employment and low inflation. Now, for emerging economies, that is difficult, in the sense that their currencies are not international, in the sense of being internationally traded. But for a country like Australia or the US or the UK, another key element of enabling monetary and fiscal policy to be devoted to domestic objectives is to have a floating exchange rate. then the foreign exchange market and the balance of payments sorts itself out without monetary policy having to be adjusted to attract capital inflow or anything like that. Emerging economies often have fixed exchange rates, which is very dangerous. And I'll give you a couple of very quick examples. Because then you have to, you can't focus simply on domestic objectives through your monetary and fiscal policy. The final point in terms of currency sovereignty is avoid foreign currency debt. Yes, you can pay off debt denominated in your own currency. You have to pay off foreign currency denominated debt in that foreign currency. And countries can very easily take on so much foreign currency debt that they can't actually pay it back. And Eurozone countries sort of fit into that category, and Greece had major problems 2 or 3 years ago when the ECB played hardball. Now, Australia has no foreign currency debt, public debt, and it hedges its any private foreign currency denominated debt. Now, why is a floating exchange rate so critical? Well, I've said you can devote your energies to domestic policy considerations. Those two crises, which are talked about in the textbook, not that I'm here to advertise the textbook as such, those crises were both associated with countries with fixed exchange rate. They took out foreign currency loans. They tried to defend their currencies through cutting spending and raising interest rates, which is designed to take pressure off of their currency. And when they actually let their currencies float, surprise, surprise, they fell very significantly against the US dollar. There is another example which I think is very interesting about a crisis, and that was the ERM crisis, when Britain fixed its exchange rate against the German mark, and it got into horrendous problems because it wanted to keep that rate unchanged. I won't go into the detail of that because I know time is passing. Now, the final thing I want to talk about, almost the final thing, is the issue of running deficits. Now, orthodox economists, and this is being a bit sort of crude about orthodox economists, would argue, though, that running deficits by government is discretionary. If the market system is working well, you know, we can talk about small government. So yes, we have defence forces, and obviously we've got to have laws to protect private property. This is taking an extreme position. But we don't expect a lot of government spending on programs to improve the environment or improve urban space or whatever. So the question is, can you have a sustainable macroeconomy which doesn't rely on government deficits? Now, as I said earlier on, post-Keynesians argue effective demand is the key to full employment. This has got very small for reasons which aren't clear. Anyway, can people still read it? Yeah, anyway. So this comes from the national accounts. The statisticians have arbitrarily, or not quite arbitrarily, divided total spending up between final consumption expenditure, what we spend our money on, private investment, that's the acquisition of capital equipment, government expenditure, which can be both taking the form of government investment, if government builds roads like freeways and what have you, although the private sector, state governments seem to be more into that nowadays, but equally paying public servants, which is a rather different form of expenditure. And then we've got net exports. So it's spending on exports, what countries have bought from us minus what we've bought from them. And then what we do to go from gross domestic product to gross national product, we add external income flows, and these are quite important. So these are the flows of income that come into the country because our residents own foreign assets, minus the flows of income that go out of the country because foreigners have interests in this country. It could be government debt, but equally it could be the multinational resource extractors, whether it's BHP, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a flow of income, profit and dividends going out of the country because of the ownership of BHP or the shareholders being all over the world. On the income side, we can talk about the income received by citizens as being divided between consumption, saving, and taxes. Now, if we fiddle around with those two, and I'm not going to do the arithmetic, we can set up what can be referred to as financial balances. And what we've got with the last one, just to be clear, CAB is net exports, where we've also included the income part, so it's the current account. So we've got the trade part, which is the X minus M, which we've been dealing with up to now, but this is then, we're including that income, and that's defined as the current account rather than the trade balance. It's important to realise if that CAB is positive, then the country's running a surplus on the current account. Few countries run persistent surpluses. Japan and Germany are two examples of developed economies. Current account balances must sum to zero across the world. So for every country that runs a surplus in the world, there must be one that runs a deficit. Because ultimately they all cancel out because these items have corresponding values for the other countries. So if you believe in export-led growth as the panacea for universal macro policy, it ain't going to work because you can't have all countries doing it. Now, this turns out to be overall net saving by the private sector. So it's saving, which can be both households and firms. Firms save by retaining profit and not distributing it. And we're taking off investment. So, and here to think about it in the simplest way, this is what we save and this is what we need to borrow for investment. So the difference between the two is what's happened to the financial balance of the private sector. So if it's positive, the private sector is spending less than its total income. So we're back to these balances again, and adds to its stock of financial assets. The final one is the fiscal balance, is in surplus when that is positive, and the overall thing is positive. In other words, tax revenue is greater than the other two combined. Right, now what the interesting thing is that countries like USA, although they're working on it with Mr. Trump and his trade policy, if you can call it that, the UK and Australia, they've been running persistent current account deficits, which means, given the way we define CAB, and it's got a minus sign in front of it, means that last term is positive. What does that mean? It means one or both of the other two terms has got to be negative. So either the private sector is running a deficit, S less than I, or the government is running a deficit. You've got to have one of them, or both. You can't have them both running surpluses. Now, the UK Office of Budget Responsibility talked about deficits and surpluses are similar to losses and profits for a company. That is the most outrageous claim that I found recently. If that's true, and you see here what's implied here is that really government's just like one big company, and it really shouldn't make losses, or certainly shouldn't make them on a consistent basis. If it's true, they have a major dilemma, policymakers. Should the government and or the private sector run deficits? One of them's got to. The dominant narrative, of course, has been that the major policy goal is that in both Australia and the UK, is that restoring the fiscal position to surplus is the priority. So, in other words, I don't know whether they're just trying to say the fiscal position is much more important than the private sector position. I don't know what they think they're arguing there. It is fundamentally misleading. Okay. Oh, gosh, what's happened? Oh. I've gone over one. Now, this is it may be a little complicated, but it's very interesting. We've got three separate items here, and they add up to 0. So if you represent the ones that are positive at any time in the positive quadrant, and you add together, if necessary, the 2 or 1 that's negative, and putting it in the negative quadrant, then you can represent your identity with something that is actually what's in the positive quadrant is a mirror image of what's in the negative quadrant. And what I mean by that is if you take the example in 1999, where the negative entry is about 7, -7, then the positive entry's got to be +7. And all we're doing is moving the components around according to whether they're positive or negative. Now, this is interesting. First of all, I made the claim Australia runs current account deficits. That is shown by all the red bars which are in the positive quadrant, given the way we define external balance. Okay, there was a moment in the sun, back whenever, even selling lots of iron ore hasn't fixed the problem here because we've got that income flow. All these greedy multinationals who are pulling up the iron ore and selling it are taking profits overseas. Secondly, negative private domestic balances, 1996 to 2007, when Costello ran his fiscal surpluses. So think about it. So government's running a surplus, we've got a current account deficit, therefore the private sector is running a deficit. And you can see that by the private domestic balance being, from about 1996 onwards in the negative quadrant. So there is a negative financial balance for the private sector all the way through, and very large. That's not good news for the private sector. Third point, large fiscal deficits and small private sector surpluses 2010 to 2012. So the government, as you can see, the government position, fiscal position, went from his surpluses, where that sort of purple colour is in the positive quadrant, down into the negative quadrant. And what's happened is that there's been an attempt to reduce the deficits, And that's been accompanied so that these entries have become smaller, they've sort of converged towards the horizontal axis, and that's been accompanied by negative private sector balances. And both parties are responsible for this sort of thing. Wayne Swan was the same. He was always trying to get to surplus and never succeeded, never had enough tax revenue. And you can see that this is a very destructive path. So the point I'm trying to make here is, unless you can massively change the external balance and make it so that there is a current account surplus, if you can't do that, which obviously is not easy, you are stuck with either government runs persistent deficits, which is what it should do, or the private sector runs persistent deficits, which it can't do. So I was making the point earlier, just with our simple example of a financial balance, if you keep overspending, unless you're exceptionally wealthy, you're going to get into crisis. Now, I could talk about inflation and fiscal policy, but I think I'll just stop here, but I can come back to the issue of inflation if time permits, because I don't want to chew up all the time. Just to now focus on the household rather than households and firms, this is household gross debt to disposable income. And you can see that during the Howard era, it went up quite steeply. Then it sort of flattened around the GFC, and then it's gone up again. That's one of the highest debt ratios in the world. And the important thing to realize, it's not purely due to those financial balances. Why is that the case? Well, because the financial balance we're looking at is the private sector. So it's the overall entity with households and firms. What does not get picked up when you take the private sector as a whole is that households borrow from firms. But that simply disappears when you're taking the overall sector, because it's an internal transaction, so to speak. So from a balance sheet point of view, it disappears. And we've actually shown household debt to disposable income just to highlight the role of housing. So it's not entirely driven by the sectoral balances. It's compounded by what's happened with housing. But really, when all is said and done, this is dangerous. And it's getting worse. And it can, in part, obviously be related to the housing market. That if we have a major recession, even if house prices hold up, people will lose their jobs and they won't be able to meet their mortgages. So there is obviously there's a housing problem in terms of booms and busts, but equally the role of those sectoral balances, which I just showed you, ain't helping things. And if the private sector is running a continuous deficit, that is unsustainable. They're doing exactly the same thing in the UK, and it's just daft. They do not understand financial balances. The sectors, that comes from first-year macroeconomics when you write down the national account identity. GDP equals this spending, that spending, and the other. So, in summary, and I will come back to inflation if you've got the energy to sit around and listen, is typically government deficits are essential to sustain the economy because you simply can't have the private sector running persistent deficits. And this is all based on the existence of a current account deficit. Secondly, there is no financing issue with government spending. Because if we're talking about Australia or the UK, we're talking about governments spending their own currency which they issue. So debt is really a product, or the sale of debt is a product of monetary policy. It's not a product of the Treasury trying to decide how it's going to finance its deficit. So, and thirdly, and sort of relatedly, the idea that developed economies which have very high debt ratios are going to face insolvency, or high inflation for that matter, simply is not so. I mean, a number of countries, including Japan, including Australia, are facing inflation rates which are too low and not too high. Now, sorry, I've gone rather a long time. I'll stop, and I certainly will welcome questions.